Picture a sanctuary built to hold 25,000 people, and on a given Sunday, barely a third of those seats are filled. The lights are still bright, the choir is still singing, but everyone in the room can feel it. Something has been broken here, and nobody quite knows how to fix it. That was New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in the years after 2010. One of the most powerful Black megachurches in American history, sitting just outside Atlanta, staring down a crisis that would have ended most institutions for good. This is the story of how a church built almost entirely around one larger-than-life preacher nearly collapsed when that preacher fell, and then, against long odds, rebuilt itself into something bigger, stranger, and arguably more resilient than what came before. If you have ever wondered what happens to an organization when its founder disappears, whether that founder is a pastor, a CEO, or a movement leader, stay with me, because this story has lessons that go far beyond church walls. Let's rewind to the beginning. New Birth traces its roots back to 1939. But the version of the church most people know was really built starting in 1987, when a young magnetic preacher named Eddie Long took over a congregation of around 300 members in Lithonia, Georgia. Long was a phenomenon. He preached what's often called the prosperity gospel, the idea that faith and financial blessing walk hand in hand, and under his leadership, the church exploded. Within a couple of decades, New Birth's membership had ballooned past 25,000 people, making it one of the largest congregations in the entire country. Long wasn't just a local pastor, either. He built a national profile, officiated the funeral of Coretta Scott King, courted politicians, and became one of the most recognizable faces of Black megachurch Christianity in America. The church itself became a kind of small city, with its own school, its own broadcast network, and enormous financial reach. But there was a problem baked into that success, and it's a problem that shows up again and again in organizations built around one dominant personality. The entire institution was fused to a single man. When Eddie Long thrived, New Birth thrived. And when Eddie Long's reputation cracked, the whole structure cracked with it. That's exactly what happened starting in September of 2010, when 4 young men filed a civil lawsuit accusing Long of using his position and church resources to coerce them into sexual relationships when they were teenagers under his spiritual guidance. A 5th accuser came forward soon after. The allegations detailed a pattern of gifts, trips, cars, and jewelry, all funded, the lawsuits claimed, through New Birth's accounts, used to draw young men into abusive dynamics. Long denied every allegation, and after months of mediation, the case was settled out of court in 2011 and dismissed with prejudice, meaning the accusers were barred from ever refiling the same claims. The financial terms were never made fully public, though later reporting estimated the total settlement was worth well over $1 million. On top of that, New Birth was already facing scrutiny from a congressional investigation into the finances of several prominent televangelist ministries, a probe that found Long's team unwilling to answer basic questions about pastoral compensation. The damage to the church was immediate and it was lasting. Members left in droves. Contributions dropped. The prosperity gospel brand that had built New Birth into a spiritual empire became, almost overnight, a source of public suspicion. And through all of it, Eddie Long stayed in the pulpit. He never publicly addressed the specifics of the allegations. But in later sermons, he admitted to the congregation that he had once been in such despair he considered taking his own life. He remained senior pastor until January of 2017, when he died from an aggressive form of cancer at the age of 63. By then, membership at New Birth had fallen from its 25,000-person peak down to roughly 10,000 people, less than half of what it once was, and the church was left facing a question that a lot of scandal-scarred organizations eventually have to answer. Who do you become when the person everyone associated with you is suddenly gone? Fortunately, New Birth wasn't walking into that moment completely blind. Back in 2013, years before Long's death, the church's leadership had quietly put together a succession plan, the kind of contingency document that a lot of founder-led organizations never bother to write. So when Long passed away, the church didn't spiral into a leadership vacuum. It activated that plan almost immediately, installing Bishop Stephen A. Davis, who had been running New Birth's satellite campus in Birmingham, Alabama, as the new senior pastor. Davis wasn't chosen to be a visionary reinventor. He was chosen to be a steady hand, someone who could hold the congregation together while it grieved. Both the loss of its founder and the lingering wound of the scandal that had never really been resolved in the eyes of many members. For about 16 months, Davis focused almost entirely on emotional stabilization, trying to help a wounded congregation simply keep breathing. But stabilization is not the same thing as transformation. And in June of 2018, Davis resigned and returned to Birmingham, leaving New Birth's board of directors to make a much bigger decision than they had the first time around. This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because instead of doing what a lot of churches do in this situation, which is quietly hand the pulpit to a relative of the founder, New Birth's board, chaired by the influential Thomas Dortch Jr., made a deliberate choice to look outward. There was real pressure and real expectation that Eddie Long's own son, Edward Long, might step into the role. Instead, the board launched a nationwide search, reviewing applications from more than 130 candidates across the country. Think about how unusual that is for an institution that had spent 30 years organized around a single bloodline of charisma. The board wasn't just looking for someone who could preach well. They were looking for someone who could reverse a membership freefall, rebuild public trust, and give the congregation a completely new reason to believe in the institution again, separate from any one person's personal mythology. In November of 2018, after that extensive search, the board landed on Jamal Bryant, and on paper. He was almost the opposite kind of pastor from Eddie Long. Bryant came out of a completely different tradition, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, as a third-generation preacher whose father and grandfather were both Ame bishops. He'd built his own reputation not primarily as a prosperity preacher, but as a civil rights-oriented activist voice. Having spent years as the National Youth and College Director of the NAACP, where he helped mobilize tens of thousands of young people around nonviolent organizing. He earned his undergraduate degree from Morehouse College, a Master of Divinity from Duke University, and later a Doctorate of Ministry, before New Birth called him. Bryant had spent 18 years building Empowerment Temple in Baltimore from a founding congregation of just 47 people into a church of more than 10,000 members, essentially proving he could do at scale exactly what New Birth needed most: grow an institution from almost nothing. He preached his first sermon as pastor-elect on December 9th of 2018. And was formally installed as New Birth's fourth senior pastor in its history the following year, becoming just the fourth person to hold that pulpit since the 1980s. Bryant didn't tiptoe around the church's painful history either. In interviews around the time of his hiring, he was blunt about the fact that New Birth had to directly confront what had happened rather than simply move past it in silence, saying plainly that the congregation had to deal with the scandal and minister to the people it had hurt. That willingness to name the wound, rather than paper over it with a new face and a new logo, turned out to be one of the more important strategic choices in the entire rebuilding process, because it signaled to a skeptical membership that this new era wasn't going to repeat the old pattern of silence and denial. But naming the past was only step one. The real transformation Bryant pursued was structural, and this is really the heart of the story. Shifting New Birth away from being a personality-driven institution and toward being a community-driven one. Under Eddie Long, the church's identity had essentially been, "This is Bishop Long's church." Under Bryant, the strategy became something closer to, "This is a platform the community owns together, and the pastor is simply the one stewarding it forward." You can see that philosophy playing out in almost everything New Birth has built over the past several years. Take financial literacy. Rather than simply preaching about faith and blessing in the abstract, the way prosperity gospel churches traditionally have, New Birth started building actual financial education infrastructure for its members, teaching people concrete skills around credit building, investing, and long-term wealth preservation. That culminated most dramatically in 2026 with the launch of an initiative Bryant has branded Black Ground, a 6-pillar economic empowerment framework built around homeownership, financial literacy, education, food security, and civic and voting engagement. One of those pillars, called Firm Ground, is specifically dedicated to delivering high-level financial education and investment strategy to members, while another pillar, Holy Ground, positions the church itself as the institutional engine funding and coordinating the whole ecosystem. Then there's land development. And this is where New Birth's strategy becomes genuinely unusual for a church of any size. During Juneteenth weekend of 2026, the congregation broke ground on a housing development called New Birth Village. Built on roughly 33 acres of land the church already owned in DeKalb County. The project is planned to include hundreds of housing units, with reporting putting the number in the range of 300 to nearly 400 homes. And by the time of the groundbreaking, more than 3,000 people had already expressed interest in buying a home there before a single unit was finished. Bryant framed the project around a simple but pointed idea that teaching financial literacy alone isn't enough to close generational wealth gaps, and that a church sitting on valuable land has both the opportunity and, in his view, the obligation to convert that asset into actual home ownership for its community. It's a striking evolution for an institution that not too long ago was better known for headlines about lawsuits than headlines about groundbreaking ceremonies. Civic engagement rounds out the third leg of the rebuild. New Birth has positioned itself as a hub not just for spiritual life, but for economic organizing and political participation. The church has run a long-running food distribution program that, by 2026, had reportedly provided meals and resources to more than 1 million families going back to the earliest days of the pandemic, operating on a model that serves anyone who shows up, no questions asked. Bryant has also used the pulpit to organize consumer activism, most notably around a boycott effort targeting a major retail chain, which the church folded into a broader campaign to support Black-owned businesses, connecting participants with networks that include well over 100,000 Black-owned businesses nationwide. He's testified and appeared as guest chaplain before the Georgia state legislature, pushing lawmakers directly on economic development policy. And every year, the church runs a leadership and business conference designed to connect members with mentorship, funding, and professional networks, essentially trying to build an internal chamber of commerce inside the congregation itself. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened instantly. It took a predetermined succession plan that prevented total chaos in the immediate aftermath of Long's death. It took a caretaker pastor whose entire job was simply to keep the congregation emotionally intact for a year and a half. It took a board willing to resist the obvious, comfortable choice of keeping leadership inside the founder's family and instead run a genuinely competitive national search. And it took a new pastor willing to publicly acknowledge the institution's failures rather than pretend they never happened, while simultaneously building entirely new pillars: financial, physical, and civic. So the church's value to its members no longer depended on any single person's charisma or reputation. Membership has reportedly rebounded significantly under Bryant's leadership, with New Birth frequently described as one of the fastest growing churches within its denominational tradition. There's a broader lesson buried in all of this that has nothing to do with religion specifically. Almost every organization eventually faces some version of what New Birth faced: a founder who leaves, a scandal that breaks trust, a brand that becomes inseparable from one flawed human being. The organizations that survive that moment tend to share a few things in common. They plan for succession before they need it, not during the crisis itself. They give themselves permission to grieve and stabilize before trying to reinvent everything at once. They're willing to look outside their own comfort zone, even outside the family or clique that built the thing in the first place, when picking who leads next. And critically, they stop selling the founder's personality and start selling something the community can actually hold on to together, whether that's a skill, an asset, or a shared mission. New Birth's story is still being written. There are still open questions about how ambitious housing and economic projects at this scale will actually play out over the coming years, and about whether an institution once nearly destroyed by the concentration of unchecked power in one man's hands can build a healthier, more distributed model of trust going forward. But the fact that this church went from a scandal-shrunken congregation of roughly 10,000 people, mourning a leader many of them had deeply complicated feelings about, to a growing institution breaking ground on hundreds of new homes for its members, is one of the more remarkable turnaround stories in modern American religious life. If a congregation nearly torn apart by the fall of one man can rebuild itself around an entire community instead, it raises a fair question for the rest of us. How many of the institutions we're part of are still standing on one person's shoulders, and what would it take to build something sturdier underneath them? Thanks for watching, and if this kind of deep dive into institutions, power, and rebuilding is what you're here for, make sure you're subscribed, because this is exactly the kind of story we go looking for next.